You always pour so much.
I'm thirsty.
Hello, I'm Jancis Robinson, and I've been writing about wine for 44 years, writing things like my latest book, World Atlas of Wine, 8th edition.
I'm Richard Brendan, and I'm a product designer.
So we're here at Food 52 today, and we are now going to talk about some common wine myths.
I had been designing cut crystal barware for quite a few years, and people were asking me to design a wine glass, and really I realised I couldn't do that on my own. I had to work with an expert because it wasn't a purely aesthetic exercise, it had to be functionally perfect. And when I asked everyone I knew in London who knew anything about wine, everyone said that Jancis would be the best person to work with. So I got in touch, and we had a coffee, and I think within an hour, maybe an hour and a half, Jancis had really explained to me, actually we were only going to design one wine glass for every single type of wine. She explained if we designed the perfect glass, it would work for champagne, port, sherry, red, white, you name it.
So here we have proof of the versatility of our beautiful glass. All sorts of different wines. And I'm sure if we were to taste these wines, we would see that it was bringing out the best in each one. Because I've just never seen the point of having a different shape or size of glass for a white wine. That white wine is every bit as interesting, complex, deserves the space as red wine. And here we're just making life simple for everybody.
I think what's really struck a lot of my friends who have started using the glasses, and they're not necessarily wine people, but they've said, wow, you know, we've been putting champagne or sparkling wine in the glass, and they can't believe the difference it makes.
And I mean, those narrow glasses, it's quite difficult to get the nose of the wine, isn't
Absolutely.
it?
They said, you know, they've never actually, enjoyed the aromas of a sparkling wine before, because in a flute you just don't get any of that. And you know, likewise with port and sherry, usually they're put in these tiny little glasses, and there's no room for the wine to move or for the aromas to get out.
And you, of course, the whole point of this shape is you swirl the wine round to release the aroma. So you've really got a sort of ideal shape for maximum pleasure, which is what it's all about, after all.
And you know, going back to the very first stages when we were talking about the design, I remember you saying the opening needed to be as small as possible, but still big enough that even
for a big nose
can fit inside. So, you know, that's exactly what we did.
So everyone says you've got to drink white wine with fish, red wine with meat, but that's a lazy kind of generalisation. If you feel like drinking a red wine with fish, like this lovely mackerel here, you know, there are all sorts of red wines that are just as good with fish as white wines. Like this is a fleury, which means it's a good quality Beaujolais. And Beaujolais is an awful lot like white wine in many ways. And I think, yeah, it's just as crisp and refreshing as a typical white wine, and would go really well with fish that you like to have a little bit of an acid with, like such as there's the little bit of lemon here. And then with your great big pork chop, no problem at all to have a white wine. I bet you could have a mouthful of that, a mouthful of the pork chop, and survive. You know, I think people make far, far too much fuss about food and wine pairings. I mean, suppose you do get a wine that doesn't go brilliantly with your food. What's the worst that can happen? You know?
Yeah.
You just have a mouthful of water in between, or maybe a mouthful of neutral bread or something like that, and then carry on enjoying your wine and your food separately.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, I would say the two most important factors in enjoying wine, apart from having a decent liquid, obviously the glass. I think we'd agreed there.
Absolutely.
Very important. But the other factor is temperature. And you can really enhance the whole experience by serving your wine at a sort of temperature that's going to make it look as delicious, make it taste as delicious as possible. And again, the common perception is chill white wines, serve reds at room temperature, whatever that is. But it's actually much more finely balanced than that. And in essence, the warmer something is, the more you can taste. So you don't want to chill whites too much. And with red wines, there's nothing worse than it being too hot. And our rooms nowadays are much, much hotter than when that room temperature rule came up, which was in the kind of Victorian days or something like that. So you don't want reds to be room temperature. If they get too warm, then the flavour just evaporates and the whole thing is kind of sludgy and soupy. In fact, the ideal serving temperatures of red and white are much closer together than you would think. And an awful lot of reds benefit from being lightly chilled, because you can always easily make a wine a little bit warmer than you serve it just by cupping it in your hand. Your hand will transmit some warmth, but very difficult to get it down in temperature.
You could even put your red wine into the stemless glass, couldn't you, Jancis?
Yeah, you could, I suppose. And a light-bodied red wine, like a Beaujolais, like this Fleury, is an ideal candidate for chilling. The more likely that your red wine is to go with fish, the more it will respond to being chilled. But you wouldn't believe the number of times in a restaurant I have asked for an ice bucket for the red because they serve the reds too warm.
And what temperature's a cellar?
About 55.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, if you pull bottles straight out of the cellar, a full-bodied white wine, a white Burgundy, would be more or less at the right temperature. And a red, have it in your kitchen or whatever for half an hour, it would be perfect. So there are two reasons to decant wine. And one of them, perhaps the more common, is to aerate it, to expose it to oxygen and kind of almost artificially age it. And that's something that a young wine really benefits from, particularly a wine that you're going to open maybe a year or two before it fully matures. A lot of people think that you only decant red wine, but that is not the case. In fact, a young white Burgundy really benefits from being exposed to lots of air. And you see I'm kind of pouring it over the inside so that it's maximally exposed to oxygen. And this is the bit that I absolutely love at home. I'm always swooshing. This is a beautifully designed decanter for swooshability. Really whiz it around, open it up to oxygen, make it taste as though it's a year or two older than it actually is. Honestly, red or white, you will see some transformation, and you can actually almost save money because you're serving a young wine that's you've given extra age to. But the other reason for decanting a wine is if it's really quite old and has developed sediment in the bottom of the bottle, which is a very good sign of quality because it means it wasn't over-filtered and so on when it was made. And this is the old wine decanter for pouring off the wine off the sediment and then protecting it from the ravages of oxygen with your beautifully designed stopper.
And is there a rule of thumb for how old a red wine would be before you decant?
Get the sediment. It does depend where it comes from, but probably maybe more than 10 years you might want to decant. Certainly at 20 years you probably want to decant it. Yeah.
And something I've noticed since launching the collection, talking to people about decanting, a lot of people seem very nervous about decanting and they think it's this mystery. Do you have any advice to those people?
Well, if you're pouring wine off sediment, it's pretty important that you can see the sediment. So it does help if you've got a strong light source behind the decanter when you're pouring the bottle into it. So that can either be a torch or a candle, or a flashlight, you know?
Yeah. So is it true, Jancis, that all wine improves with age?
Absolutely not. That's one of those favourite myths. In fact, probably by volume, well over 90% of all wine produced, probably more like 95, actively goes downhill after a few months in bottle. And the cheap and cheerful wine is made to be drunk as soon as it gets on a shelf. And it's really only wine that you'd pay, say, over $30, $40 a bottle that actually improves in the bottle.
And what is it that gives a wine the potential to age and improve?
Obviously the quality of the grapes in the first place, and that it hasn't been stripped of everything before it was put in the bottle. A lot of heavy filtration. There's nothing left in there to actually develop. Whereas in a good quality wine, you've got lots and lots of tiny little compounds that are kind of all knitting together, and some of them are precipitated, which is what the sediment is in the bottom of the bottle. So a lot of people get rather terrified by what I call the grape tasting ritual in a restaurant. So I'm going to explain how it works. So the waiter will bring over the bottle that you ordered, and your job is just to check that it's exactly what you ordered. I've noticed particularly vintages changed. So the waiter's going to pour a little tasting sample, great, which is lovely. And what I'm doing here is I'm checking for two things. One, that it smells clean. It's not got some horrible mouldy thing that's the result of a bad quality cork. You could actually do that just by smelling it. If you want to impress the som, that you're an insider pro, you might just smell it rather than taste it. That's clean, thank you. And you're not checking to see whether you like it, because the cork has been pulled and it's your decision to have chosen that particular wine.
And what does corked wine smell like?
Mouldy cardboard.
Okay.
The other thing though, if you're going to taste it, or you could feel it, the other thing you're checking is the temperature, and that's what I often do. Because if you decide it's too warm, whether it's red or white, you can ask quite legitimately for an ice bucket or some way of chilling the bottle. And if you think it's too cold, you say, please don't put this in an ice bucket, just leave it on the table so it'll warm up. Perfect temperature. Thank you very much. Now, one very popular newish category of wine is natural wine. And the idea behind natural wine, which is not an official definition, but the philosophy is that the wine producer adds as few additives in the cellar as possible, and ideally makes the wine from vineyards that have been treated minimally with any pesticides, herbicides, all that kind of thing. But of course the thing about natural wines, because it's not defined, anyone can say that they're making a natural wine. But a good clue is if, as this wine, on the back label it says a very low sulfur dioxide content. In this case it's 20 milligrams per litre, which is pretty low. Sulfur is a very natural preservative. The Romans used it. Pretty much every fruit juice, every dried fruit you've ever had has had some sulfites added to it to keep it fresh. Actually, sulfur is a natural byproduct of fermentation, so it's pretty much impossible to have 0 sulfites, but this 20 is low. So there's natural wine, and then there is organic, which means that the farmer, they've given up on the agrochemicals, which were so popular in the second half of the last century, and they are using much more wholemeal methods, more like their grandparents did. I'll just pour this and see what it's like. And then there's another, now that looks as though it's a white wine that's been kept in contact with the skins. So it's actually, they call it an orange wine because for rather obvious reasons. And I think you have there a biodynamic wine, don't you?
I do.
Which is like a kind of advanced sort of, you always pour so much.
I'm thirsty.
Biodynamic is a lot more demanding than organic vine growing. You do things in sync with the cosmic calendar. You do sort of things like add nettle tinctures buried in cow horns at each corner of the vineyard. It sounds completely crazy, but it does seem to result in some pretty good wines. And biodynamically grown vines look different. They look healthier, and the soils are definitely healthier. So shall we see what we think? Obviously the glass is perfect for both of these. Tangy, very tangy, and not, because it's 10 years old, it's actually not as chewy as some young orange wines. That's not clear, is it?
It's not clear. Not much filtration going on there.
No. What does it taste like?
Doesn't taste as bad as it smells, I should have said.
No. That's a very natural sort of smell. Which some people absolutely love.
Yeah,
Yeah. So I think it's
cagey.
good that there are so many different ideas of wine quality. So you remember though that I was adamant that our glasses had to be dishwasher friendly, because so many glasses get broken when people are polishing them and washing them by hand, and because I'm lazy.
One of the biggest challenges actually is, you know, when I'm talking to, you know, people who pick up the glass, they still think they ought to hand wash them. They think it's such a beautiful light glass. Their default is it should be hand washed, that's safer, but actually it's the exact opposite. If you put these in the dishwasher, they just don't get broken. It's when people start hand washing, usually after a dinner party where they've maybe had a couple of glasses of wine, and the tap comes in contact with the glass and it is
magically. Yeah. I love the look of them. I love using them. I love what they do to and for wine. And I think we should be very proud of what we've done.
I agree.